So a lot has happened on Libya, a lot of questions coming in. So this is about trying to clarify some of the things, trying to bring all these questions together and answer some of them as best as I can. Firstly, it's clear that Turkey has upended the dynamics in Libya. By taking Al-Wati in particular, a very important military base, Turkey has essentially paved the way for cementing at least a short-term and medium-term military presence, if not long-term. Turkey has completely changed the military dynamics. A military solution is now, at least for the short and medium term, out of the question, and Haftar's Tripoli offensive has been brought to an end. Turkey's intervention has also caused ripples in the east between Aqil Saleh, between Haftar, between the various different factions that have supported Haftar. We saw a meeting between Aqil Saleh, the head of the House of Representatives, with certain members of the military, certain members of the armed groups that are fighting with Haftar. And we noticed an absence of Haftar. Whether this suggests that Aqil Saleh is planning to sideline Haftar or reduce some of his powers, that will depend, of course, on how much Russia, which is a new resurgent power in Libya, how much Russia is willing to expend in terms of resources and how far it's willing to push in Libya. It's clear that Russia now wants to become heavily involved in Libya. It no longer just wants a bit part role. And that's mainly because the UAE now finds itself in an awkward position. Of course, we're going from one dot to another dot to another dot. The reason that the UAE, now we bring it here, is that the UAE was the prime backer of Haftar. It was the UAE supplying the weapons, supplying the money. Egypt was providing logistics, but UAE was the main backer of Haftar and indeed the main supporter of the Tripoli offensive. There is rumors that Egypt was not necessarily for it, and neither were the Russians. And Lavrov, a few months back, did say that Russia did not have as much influence on Haftar as people assumed. But UAE now are finding themselves in an awkward position. Not only has the Tripoli offensive failed, but there's also a resurgent US. And there is an angry US, which means it makes UAE very uncomfortable. Because unlike Turkey, which is able to strong-arm the US, as we've seen it in Syria, we'll remember that Turkey's pressure on US support for the PKK and YPG, the extent to which Turkey was willing to go to antagonize the US, saw the purchase of S-400 missiles, and also saw the US quickly dispatch the Vice President and Pompeo to go to Ankara to speak with Erdogan in a bid to try to calm him down. So we've seen that Turkey is able to strong-arm the US, but the UAE doesn't have that power. The UAE does not have that capability within its bilateral relationship with the US. The UAE's relationship with the US is heavily built on this idea of investments, on this idea of money and its lobbying power. But unlike Turkey, the UAE cannot force the US into a position it does not want to be in without suffering consequences, either pressure within the region, in the Middle East, or media pressure put on the UAE that will put it at loggerheads with the US. In other words, an angry US means that the UAE, it will consider between backing Haftar or maintaining its relationship with the US. And for the UAE, that's an easy choice. The UAE is willing to abandon Haftar if it means protecting a relationship with the US, and we may see a reorganization of UAE policy. But that withdrawal of the UAE leaves space now for Russia to really cement itself, really expand itself, restrict Haftar's powers, because Haftar quite simply doesn't listen to anyone, and embolden Aqil Saleh and the House of Representatives. And Russia essentially is likely to try to push for a scenario similar to Syria, in which Turkey and Russia are the main power brokers. In Libya, Turkey, GNA, and Russia, LNA. Turkey is not necessarily for or against any of these scenarios. Turkey is happy to engage in a framework of cooperation with the Russians, but now it finds itself, it needs to balance with the US, an angry US, which is now resurgent, which is now reaffirming its support for the GNA after being quiet throughout the Tripoli offensive. We've seen the US now reaffirm its support for the GNA, and that in itself poses its own complications, because Turkey wants good relations with the US for its economy, but wants good relations with Russia in order to help prevent the US bullying tactics from Donald Trump and US sanctions. It wants to use Russia as leverage against the US, but wants good relations with the US for the sake of its economy. So it wants to play on this balancing act. But US involvement in Libya causes problems in that even if Turkey is the power that rescued the Libyan government, the government of national accord, even if Turkey is the party that rescued these factions, that rescued the groups fighting with the government of national accord, that rescued Serraj, the reality is that there is this prevalent inferiority complex among the political elite, Arab political elite generally, not just in Libya, whereby if the US come knocking, you open the door, you sit with the US and you discuss with the US. And Turkey may well find that these groups that fought with the government of national accord, that it relied on to push back Haftar, that it expects some sort of gratitude from, perhaps in a similar way to which France expected gratitude from the powers after it ousted Gaddafi. Turkey may well find that these groups will be lobbying the US for a special relationship similar to that between Misrata and between the US. US were backing Misrata, claiming they were the group to help fight terrorism, and that's what helped embolden Misrata and make them into one of the most dominant factions. So Turkey is going to find itself playing a balancing act. Now, some people respond and they say, well, Turkey has been developing ties with the regional powers, Algeria and Tunisia and the like. But Russia makes this quite complicated, because Algeria is already upset with the US because Washington shot down Algeria's nomination for UN envoy to Libya, Ramtan al-Amamra. The US shot down that nomination, which means that Algeria, which is technically looking for a political solution in Libya, it wants stability in Libya so that it can resume having access to Libya's economy in order to help its own economic crisis. Tunisia and Algeria used to rely a lot on the Libyan economy, the trade between these countries. Algeria is upset with the US and has an extensive history with Russia, extensive ties with Moscow, historically warm ties with Moscow. And one of the reasons that Washington shot down Algeria's nomination was because they believed that Algeria was too close to Russia, and that by allowing Algeria's nomination, they would essentially be pushing Libya more into the Russian sphere. So if Turkey wants to balance between the US and Russia and maintain its own leverage by going with a regional power, it is possible that Russia may expand its Libya policy to include Algeria, and there's nothing preventing Algeria from jumping into the same bloc as Russia or cooperating with Russia at the expense of the US. And this is where we go into the question of how far is the US willing to push and how far is Europe willing to push on Libya. Libya is not Syria, as Le Drian suggested, the French foreign minister, with regards to Libya, that it might become a new Syria. Libya is more important for Europe than Syria because it's just across the Mediterranean, it's very close. But not only that, Libya is about to be under two power brokers who are antagonistic to Europe. For anybody who wants to look further into this, you can look at this struggle taking place in the Balkans, Serbia, Bosnia, etc., where Turkey and Russia are competing against the EU and competing against one another. UAE is also involved in the Balkans, trying to pressure the Balkans. But if you imagine that Turkey can only access the Balkans in one way, from the Mediterranean, from Libya, it can access another way, causing further complications. And it also gives Turkey and Russia greater access to the Mediterranean that Europe would prefer to dominate. So this is why when we're looking at the possibility to what extent US and Europe, what actions are they willing to take in order to try to prevent this Turkey-Russia domination of Libya, they may actually take far more steps than we've seen before. Because previously it was just a civil war. But if it becomes a geopolitical contest, then it is likely that we may see escalation from France, escalation even from Germany, escalation even from the US. Suffice to say that despite all of this, it does look as if we are going more towards negotiations and not a continuation of the war. The fact of the matter is that now Libya is in this state of flux. Everybody is scrambling. Nobody is sure of what is going on here. The government of national accord is not sure to what extent it's able to control the territories that it's taken. Turkey is not entirely sure what the stance of the forces that fought with the government of national accord will be. US is not sure to what extent it can coax the groups fighting with the national accord to side with it and not necessarily with Turkey. US is not sure to what extent Turkey is going to align with the US on Libya. Russia is not sure to what extent Turkey is going to try to push for this framework of cooperation. Turkey is not sure to what extent Russia is going to try to antagonize Turkey in the way that Russia has sought to antagonize Turkey in Syria. Haftar is not sure if the new influence of Russia, the new power play of Russia in the east is going to impact him and result in his removal, or whether it will just mean a decline of powers. UAE is not sure how angry the US is. All of the US ire is going towards Russia, not necessarily to the UAE. UAE might believe that it might be able to be let off the hook, and indeed the US might use the UAE to try to pressure Turkey to get Turkey to side with the US. In other words, the pieces are all over the place and nobody is quite sure what's going on. And this is what makes negotiations much more likely. Negotiations give time for these parties to come and sit together and decide the power play. Now there's one party that's been missing from all of this analysis, and I'll end with this party, and that's the Libyan parties. Where do the Libyan parties stand in all this? The reality is that as long as infighting continues on both sides, on the east and the west, the Libyans have no say in what happens. Their future will be decided by external powers. Their future will be decided by foreign powers. And if they are not careful, they may well end up with something similar to a Dayton agreement in Bosnia, whereby their country becomes paralyzed and unable to achieve anything. In other words, now the best option for a possibility of Libyan unity actually lies with the government of national accord. If the government of national accord can send a positive message to those in the east, by positive message, not just statements, if it can find the capacity to shelve the grievances of the past decade and announce the opening of a new chapter and the policy of a national reconciliation and a national dialogue, then it may actually be able to bring about a dynamic that is far more influential and far more groundbreaking than that brought about by the Turkish military intervention. And indeed there is a precedence for this. Anybody who understands the socio-historical memory of the Middle East will know what a big role the ideas of Islam play on societies in Libya, in Algeria, in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, etc. In Islam, it is said that there is a verse in the Quran which says, ادفع بالتي هي أحسن فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة كأنه ولي حميم وما يلقاها إلا الذين صبروا وما يلقاها إلا ذو حظ عظيم. Repel evil with that which is better, with that which is good. For it may be the one who is your enemy today may be your most loyal ally tomorrow. But one does not achieve this except with patience and by essentially doing a lot of good, essentially engaging in these initiatives, engaging in these good initiatives. The question the GNA have to ask themselves now is this: are they intent on uniting Libyans and creating a new Libya, or are they intent on settling scores with the East as a result of this bitter civil war that's taking place? These are the dynamics. This is what we're looking out for in Libya. You can always send your questions in once more, but I think I've answered most of the questions that were sent in. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow either on Twitter. Of course, I have to do these disclaimers in order to help to make sure that the message actually reaches to as many people as possible. And if you feel this analysis is beneficial, do share, do spread the word, and feedback is always welcome. You can always send your questions, send your observations to contact@intlinterest.com. Until then, stay safe.